Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Nick Flores, and I'm with the Mahoney Group Insurance Agency. The Mahoney Group has been in the insurance and health benefits business for over 100 years. And last time I checked, we rank somewhere in the top 100 US brokers. In today's webinar, we hope to accomplish two things. First, we want to give you a detailed understanding of some of the defense mechanisms you can implement to help protect your organization when a breach occurs. Secondly, we want to help you understand maybe one of the most important insurance policies you can purchase, the cyber liability insurance policy. Today, we have two great speakers. First is Carlos Lohan. Carlos owns a Nerds on Site operation based out of Salt Lake City. Nerds on Site's got a cute name, but they're in a very serious business in fighting the war against cyber criminals. Carlos also spent some time in the defense industry, so he knows a thing or two about the nefarious types. Secondly is my friend Kevin Dorse. Kevin is with Amwins Insurance, an international insurance company that writes billions of dollars of premium every year. Kevin is an expert when it comes to cyber liability. Throughout today's webinar, please feel free to use our chat feature, and we will try to get to all the questions before we end. Without further ado, Carlos, take it away.
Thank you, Nick. I appreciate that. And thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your schedule to spend time with us. My topic today is network security and how you can protect yourself against the criminals out there. So why is network security so important? Recently, I think it's within the last 1 or 2 years, IBM paired up with the Ponemon Institute and did a comprehensive study of cybercrime around the world. And the shocking fact that they came across is that in that year, there was nearly $6 trillion of damage that was done to the world economy. In that same year, the gross domestic product of the world was $86 trillion. So that amounts to 7% of all productive activity in the world that was disrupted or destroyed by cyber criminals. There are two things that contributed to that. And the first thing is that the criminals are getting much more sophisticated. Networks and all the tools that underlie those networks are very useful to businesses. It gives them an outstanding opportunity to provide services to their clients. But on the other side of that, the criminals use that sophistication in a nefarious way. So they're looking at how to damage things, but they've gotten a lot more sophisticated and they've gotten a lot more organized. What they do is group together into organized crime groups. The mafia is involved and there are other people as well. Another aspect of it, the second side of that coin, is that many business leaders haven't caught up to that fact yet, and so that they don't prioritize network security. When we think about networks, the part of the reason that we have trouble protecting against crime is that the technology itself is very complex. But the policies that you can put in place are despite that complexity, if you have a strategy and you have a plan and you get help, you can definitely put in excellent protection to keep yourself safe and away from harm. Another problem is that sometimes IT managers and people like me are not so good at communicating what needs to be done. So we'll try to make that, try to make a change there. Our unified goal is to help prevent you from suffering a ransomware attack. We don't want this to happen to you. So let's think about the perspective of security from, take the scope down from a worldwide problem down to your business, to the small and medium enterprise. The statistics from the Ponemon Institute and IBM study show that of all the attacks that are leveled against businesses worldwide, 40% of them are aimed at small and medium enterprises. And then if you are hit by a cyber attack, a serious one like this, the probability that you will go out of business within the next 6 months is 60%. So more than half of the people that get hit go out of business. And if you think about that, if your business is not worth protecting, then you don't need to worry about cybersecurity. But if it is worth protecting, then you do need to think about some of the policies that you can put in place. So let me describe this model of the network from a really simple perspective. It's a layered model. We have at the foundation, we have systems, we have the next layer is applications, then we have the local area network, the transmission layer or the wide network, the internet, and then finally human factors. And one really important theme for this presentation is going to be sort of the concept of bulletproof glass. In bulletproof glass, you get layers of protection that protect against a gunshot. And the obvious analogy to the security, to network security is multiple layers can be thought of as a bulletproof glass protection for your business and your network. So let's look at these 5 layers from the perspective of how a network functions. So these can be thought of as sort of the components or the structure of your network. We start at the systems level, then we go to applications. These are the systems or devices you use, computers, and so on. The application level, those are the programs you run to do effective work. Then we have the local area network itself. This is all of the devices together and how they're tied together by the administrator. And then you have the wide area network, which is sort of the transmission layer. And that's how information from your network is communicated out to the wider internet or to the cloud. And then finally, and very importantly, they're human factors. They're human beings that use these systems. The whole point of it all is that all of those devices are tools for us to use to be productive. So let's change gears and talk about how we secure the network. And you can see these different layers here, the different color coding. There's no rhyme or reason to the colors for them, but it's just an example that shows that your security in the network can be thought of as all of these different layers, as in bulletproof glass. Now I'm going to talk about specific examples of best practices for security, and you can see all of those. I'll just mention 2 of them in this chart. Multi-factor authentication is going to be super important. That's, if you remember nothing else, you should remember multi-factor authentication. We'll get into that in the next slide. But in my opinion, zero trust connectivity is also a very important solution policy that you can implement. And I just want to briefly mention that we do have a device called the SME Edge that's extremely affordable for that kind of a solution. So not to beat a dead horse, but if you don't remember anything else, it's important to remember that multi-factor authentication, or MFA, is sort of a must-have protocol for network security. Whenever you need to connect to your network from a remote location, you might be on a sales call and you have to get a presentation together. You remember you didn't bring it with you, so you have to connect back to your network through the internet or maybe through a secure channel of some sort or another. What we need to do these days is to make that connection with multi-factor authentication. Before that, we had a method that requires something that you know, your username and your password. But with multi-factor authentication, we add another channel, and that channel is something that you have in your possession. In this case, we'll be talking about a cell phone, a smartphone with an authenticator app on it. So let me just quickly go through how it would work with multi-factor authentication. So you're sitting there at your client, you open up your computer and start your login process, put in your username and your password. That's sent through the internet and your router to your domain controller. It checks that and says, okay, hey, that's good. In the old days, that was all you needed. But with multi-factor authentication, there's another channel that has to be confirmed as well. So now the domain controller, now that it knows that you've correctly entered your username and password, encrypts a message with the 6-digit code in it, sends it back to you, but not to your computer, to your cell phone. You open up your Authenticator app, you go click on your business name, your company, and then you'll see that 6-digit code because the app decrypts the message for you. You see it, then you go to your computer, put that number in, sends it back, and now you're authenticated and you're off to the races. So let's go to the next chart. This was that previous chart was at the system layer. This is the foundation of your network. So this is on all devices or all people that use the network. We have another policy, security policy you can implement at this level called Next Generation Antivirus, or NGAV, that also usually includes anti-malware. And you can hire a contractor, a IT company to set this up for you. What we'll do under those circumstances, we'll put an agent on all your devices that runs a program and checks for viruses at all times. Whenever it finds one, it's going to quarantine that and not allow you to run that. So it protects you against viruses. At the next layer, it's called the application layer. We have an IT concept, a security concept called the need to know. And this is the same one as in the defense industry. And that is that we're going to restrict the tools that you use and the data that you need to only those people that need to use it. Anyone else, even if they're in your organization that's not working on this particular aspect of the project, does not get access. And so your administrator, let's give an example of the accounting department. You may have 3 or 4 people in your accounting department and the CFO, and those 5 people and their devices will be on an access control list, and only those people will be able to use your finance software and see the data that's relevant to accounting. And next. So we'll move up to the local network. At this layer, we have something that's almost trivially easy to do, and unfortunately, not all administrators do this. I don't know why. Operating systems are complex pieces of software that are constantly evolving. They're getting new features put in as things evolve. And so criminals look at that, and what they're looking for is what's called CVEs, or common vulnerabilities and exposures. So whenever there's a backdoor accidentally introduced into an operating system or a bug in the code, that's a way that they can get into your network. And the big providers like Microsoft and Apple and others are constantly looking for those vulnerabilities. In fact, they pay people to find vulnerabilities, and then they implement solutions to shut the doors, fix the bugs, and solve the problem. Then they broadcast that on the internet and make sure that everybody knows that it's there and that they should install it. The problem is not all administrators do that on a timely basis. So super important, very basic, and for some reason administrators tend not to do that. At the same layer, we'll talk about another security policy, and that's called segmentation. You can set up your network so that all of your devices are on one network. Generally speaking, that's not a great idea because the same rules apply how things are communicated within your network under those circumstances. So what we can do instead is we can add subnets or create subnetworks within your whole organization. Let's start with an example of the administrators and the devices that are used to administer your network. Things like application servers, backup servers, and you always want to back up data and have a copy of it in case you have a problem. And then the domain controller, that's the main sort of the brains of your system. All of those devices will be put into one segment. And then the rules of how those devices can communicate among themselves and among other devices in the network are controlled by the firewall. Then you set up separate segments for different groups other than administrators. Now you're going to have people like accounting departments, human resources, sales and marketing. And each of those groups with their devices will be put into a separate segment. And then the specific rules from the firewall define how they communicate with each other and how they can communicate with other devices in the network. And then finally, you have, these days we have something called the Internet of Things, or the IoT. And those are things like printers, surveillance cameras. There can be thermometers, temperature gauges in hospitals where they have to keep medicines in a certain level and they need to access it remotely. Obviously, the idea is those devices are proliferating. And what you want to do is create a separate segment for all of those devices in your network and make sure that the appropriate rules are in place for those as well. At the transmission layer, we're very interested in how you communicate from the devices within your network to the greater internet outside your network. And what we have in this location is something called Secure Access Service Edge. And that's a device that can sit on the edge of your network and control what goes outside of your network. So this is a policy that involves an actual device also that goes into your network. The old paradigm was such that the castle doors were open all the time. That's the default. All messages can go out. Then you create a special filter that blocks anything that's a known bad website. Any criminal enterprise, anything like that is known. We pretend that we know, we have a comprehensive list of that. And the longer that the internet is operated, the more we've understood that's not true. We can't do that anymore. It just doesn't make sense. So there's something called zero trust connectivity that turns that idea upside down. And what they do instead is we block all access. Nothing goes out unless it goes through a special filter that's called the allow list. And that means that we vet in real time every website that someone in your network wants to look at and decide whether that's a safe website or not. It's put on the allow list if it is, if not, it's not. And so this requires a device, a very powerful server that has a super fast processor. It has something called SD-WAN software built into it. That software defined wide area network access. There are protocols so that it can be very adaptive in communicating with the outside world. And then finally, there's artificial intelligence algorithms. You have behaviors of people within the network that are doing certain, the artificial intelligence algorithms learn the behaviors of your people so that you can get that allow list to be as accurate as possible. The next layer of protection is security awareness training. And the layer is the human factor layer, and the security policy is awareness training. What we'll do is that we'll conduct a phishing campaign where all of the individuals in your network are sent an email message that has a link on it that they should not click. And then instead of, what we'll do is when people do click on that, we'll not deposit a virus into your network. Instead, we'll get the information of who those people were. Then we'll do training for them, teach them about security, and also show them what it is they did wrong and how to avoid clicking on links that they shouldn't link. So this is very important, and it's something that should be done on a regular basis. You have people coming and going from the organization, and it never hurts to get updated on that. So that should be done regularly. And then finally, we have a way to monitor and assess attacks in real time. So let's imagine the situation where you've done all 5 layers of your bulletproof glass protection. You have all this good security policy in place. An additional layer is this thing called EDR, or Endpoint Detection and Response. There are companies like CrowdStrike and Sophos that put security operations centers out in the cloud. And then they'll also install agents on your devices that are going to send information about how your network is operating, all the messages that are being sent out to that operations center. That's managed 24/7. They have representatives there constantly watching. And whenever an attack happens, they'll get a notification and they can immediately contact your IT administrator, whoever you select, and that person can immediately implement a response plan. If you have an incident response plan, you can invoke that, and it could be at 2 o'clock in the morning. Whatever it is, it's being monitored 24/7. So that's a very important solution that you can implement as well. And that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for your time today. Apologies, I cannot be here live, unfortunately, as I'm sure many of us have had canceled flights and so forth. So I'm trapped in northern New York, and I'll be heading back down to Atlanta today. But anyhow, in the meantime, let's move forward. I'm going to talk about cyber in a insurance perspective. So I'm going to look through different things that we as brokers and underwriters kind of view, and just the exposures in general. So first thing, that all underwriters now used to be, name a company, website, address, and they pretty much quoted it with their revenues. Now they do a lot of things. One of the things they do is they use vendor scans of outward facing technology. And so in this situation, the carriers will use a vendor of some sort, and they would see, are there any open RDP ports? Are we seeing, emails on the dark web and things like that? So it's useful in the sense of getting a quote and also show you what sort of gaps you have in your security that your IT person may be unaware of. And so, as you might expect, there are certain things carriers now will not even consider quoting without. And so if you do not have multi-factor authentication, which is secondary code of some sort that will back up the fact that you're supposed to have the credentials to access, then they will not quote you, period, just because they're finding that, of course, getting credentials is not overly difficult. Employees regularly struggling with their ability to click on their phishing emails and so forth. And so often the weakest link in an organization is less their security, but more the individuals making silly mistakes as they go through their day. And so other things they look at is endpoint detection and response. And we're going to go through roughly 12 key areas that underwriters specifically look at. And the MFA and the endpoint detection and response, which basically secures your access points. If you have open RDP ports, then it's basically like leaving the back door of your house open and hackers can just wander straight on in. So as far as pricing, there are a number of markets. I mean, there are probably in and around 30 markets, certainly in the 20s that will write cyber. There are a number of those that are excess only, which means that they'll only do their follow form of a primary player. So quite often you might have a requirement to say 10 million in limits. So in primary carriers today doesn't like to put up usually more than 5. And so you're going to stack it. And so of the in the 20s, I would say there are probably 10, maybe 15 core markets that will do primary, and they all have different underwriting guidelines and viewpoints. But even with that many markets, we're still looking at least single-digit increases when you fixed your security issues. And it's simply because they keep getting losses, and the losses are driven primarily by the extortion-type claims, because they used to be in the tens of thousands, and now we're seeing them up in the millions. Because if your system is frozen out and you can't access it, they've sat in there for a while, so they're in your backups, you pretty much got to pay. I mean, we had a big claim here in the industry where a CNA was out of pocket for quite a while, and I think all in paid something like 40 million, and they provide cyber insurance. So it gives you a sense on the exposure. Now, we have seen markets disappear and markets reduce capacity. And so at the moment, the reinsurance is generally done at the start of the year. And what reinsurance is the carriers may be willing to put up 1, 2, 3 million max capacity, and they use a reinsurance market to allow them to put up more limit. But the reinsurance parties also have certain requirements on the book. If they're going to be taking a piece of the risk, there's certain, like requiring MFA and things like that. So the underwriters don't have the ability to say, well, yes, okay, you're my friend, I'll do it for you, because they simply aren't allowed to. So we're seeing London, there was a market over there called Ascent. They were writing insurance like no one's business, and they were probably one of the top writers for a year or so of cyber. They're completely out. We really don't see them anymore now. They are still writing, but their requirements are very strict, and so they went from a avid writer to a not really around. And then Ambridge, excellent market also, and they are back in the game and they are writing business, but there was a period last year where they had to put the brakes on. Again, it all comes down to capacity. There's a certain amount of capacity each market can put out there. And then Dual did the same thing. They had to stop writing because they had maxed out their capacity. So as the year goes on, you sometimes get capacity issues. And then, as I mentioned, there was a market that did exit, DVI. It's a large company. They write many lines of insurance, but in this particular line of cyber, they frankly just wrote it way too cheaply. They gave every coverage under the sun, and it was great for about a year or so. But then, I had clients where they were, 5 million for 16,000, and a decent sized client, which is absolutely unheard of. And they're increase sometimes as much as tenfold, but the one I'm thinking of went somewhere in the 30s, which is actually still an excellent program for their size. Actually, another is an insurance company, but it's been a bit of a struggle. But there are markets as long as you have the cybersecurity in place, which we're going to talk about. There are some changes. We're seeing carriers come in with creative supplements and co-insurance. So if, for example, you are not updating your patches, there are carriers that will have, after X number of days, I think Chubb is like 46 days, they start adding co-insurance and or reducing limits. So basically what they're saying is, if you're going to sleep at the wheel, we're going to start pulling back coverage, because really it needs to be a partnership between the insured and the insurer. And I get it. So just make sure that you are updating patches, because that's an easy way to get slammed with a hack. And this is an example here of where they're adding on the co-insurance or limit reduction as you go forward until, once you get over a year, you've really gutted your limit. You've got 10% of your limit. So if you had $1 million policy, you'd be down to 100,000, and then you would participate in 25 cents on every dollar. And then if we're also seeing some markets that if there's a hack that hacks multiple individuals, companies, they'll try and reduce their capacity. And so, for example, in this one, they're cutting down the limit to 50% if there's a multiple impact event. And the reason they want to do that is, quite frankly, if they have, a couple of thousand insureds and every single one of them get hit, that could potentially put an insurer out of business. So we are seeing this coming in. At the moment, I would say, for the most part, we're pushing through where it's it's in the policy, but it's not being triggered. And so I just imagine that if the market continues as it is, you're going to see more and more where they want to try and minimize their exposure to widespread events. And then, as mentioned before, there are some carriers that can write if you don't have MFA and EDR, but they are very few. It requires a good scan, and it just if you require more than 1 or 2 million in limits, it's very, very difficult. So I would say, those security requirements I touch on in a moment, you definitely need to hit. And just a quick give you a sense on the costs. The global average, damage from a cyber attack is over 4 million. In the US, it's over 9 million. And so this kind of breaks down, the different pieces and the costs. And so, loss of business is a massive piece. And as you may or may not know, that is covered under this under an insurance policy, the cyber business interruption, which is not covered under, say, a property policy that has business interruption. So average malware extortion claim now is in excess of 1 million. Social engineering, which is where your employee gets tricked and they, send to a wrong vendor, the account gets changed, there's no secondary verification. That's in excess of 300,000. And this is from the IBM Ponemon report, which is one of the larger analysis of the industry currently, and that's the most current one from 2021. All right, we're going to move through this relatively quickly. You can go ahead and pull down all the different checkboxes just in the be aware of timing. So we already spoke about MFA, managing the privileged accounts. So there are accounts that say your IT users have. You want to make sure that only IT users have these admin accounts, because once somebody gets in there, they can access basically everything. Making sure that they're managed, making sure that they definitely have MFA is absolutely key. Training, phishing, social engineering training. A lot of the insurers now provide that freely through, if you have a policy with them, you can go ahead and utilize it for free. But if you don't, or you don't have the insurance, I would say that's absolutely key, because a lot of the claims come from employees just not thinking and clicking on something in an email. And then we mentioned the EDR. And then there are other different, look at having programs in place to try and catch these phishing messages before they even get to employees. And there are different programs for that. And so I would say on the whole, this, and then one more slide, we're going to flip to now, where these are all the key items that the underwriters are looking at. Now, if you want a copy of these items, if you want to flip back to us and just let us know at the end of the presentation, we can certainly get the list of, I think it's roughly a dozen items over to you. But, having a regular patch update kind of speaks for itself, protecting the endpoints, closing RDP ports, and then making sure that you encrypt and you test your backups, and that has MFA. It needs to be really separate from the system. And that's I would say probably MFA, EDR, and the encrypted backups are the top three items. Some carriers now are wanting to see a security operations center, and that's something where you can have a third party that monitors the system on a 24/7 basis. And I mentioned before, making sure that only the needed people have admin rights. So insurance policy. Again, I'm going to move through this relatively quickly just because we're limited on time today, but it's actually a lot more robust than you might imagine. So most people think of third-party loss of records, and many companies don't have records. They might have private data, their employee data. Their exposure will be on the first-party side, but third-party is your network security and privacy liability if somebody gets harmed because you've been hacked. And then you're responsible for the data. So if you don't properly notify and do all the things you need to do from a regulatory standpoint, which depends upon where your client, the person who's using your service, where they are based, not where you are based. So if you have people up in Massachusetts, you might have to let the local paper know. There may be various things. If you don't do them, you're going to get the DOJs bringing claims, and it won't be just one. It will be whatever state you're in or whatever state you operate in. If you're not following their requirements, part of the insurance process is you get a breach coach, and this individual is going to make sure that you are properly notifying and doing the things you need to do. And then they're going to cover all this breach management expense. If you have an issue with payment card industry, you're having some sort of audit comes in because they're seeing a lot of fraudulent claims through your system. And then the last thing is media liability. It's not cyber, but traditionally it's included with a cyber policy unless you're a true media advertising type company. And that covers you for various things, libel, slander, anything connected with the media you're putting out there. It doesn't cover false advertising, but it's going to cover just, wrong use of images on the website, things like that. First party coverage, we already mentioned cyber business interruption. I think that's a massive coverage. A lot of the carriers will also give a smaller sublimit for contingent business interruption. That's where, let's say your IT provider goes down and you cannot do business, and let's say they were hacked. And so you get a period of a week where you can't transact business. That might cost you, in the millions, depending on the size of your business. Well, that is covered under a insurance policy. And then clearly getting your assets back, trying to reconfigure the system is going to be covered. Social engineering and cybercrime, whether it's funds transfer fraud, whether it's an employee getting tricked, that is a crossover with crime coverage. Crime coverage often does the same thing, but it is included in the cyber policy, and it normally maxes out at about $250,000. And then reputation loss. If you get a bad claim and clients move away from you because they don't trust that you have strong enough security and they're worried about how they might be harmed again, then the policy actually will cover you for the loss of profits over, I believe most of the policies are about 180 days. So that's a nice add-on, something that most people don't expect, but it's in pretty much every policy that we write. And then obviously the breach response, trying to figure out what happened, fixing the situation is also a coverage under the policy under first party. I would say first party, in my opinion, outside of a massive class action or some major regulatory issue, is where a lot of the the money and the value is in these policies, as opposed to, the liability type situations. And so you can also get sublimits for cyber bodily injury. So let's say if you have a manufacturing process, or heaven forbid, if you're a hospital, somebody gets harmed because of a hack, they're usually sublimited 250, 500, but that's a nice add-on. Not in every policy, but good to have. The carriers are moving away from having their breach response and notification costs outside of the limit, but you still do see that. So if you're comparing a couple of policies, that would be a good thing because it would preserve the limit otherwise. And then having an additional $1 million for defense costs, it's a nice to have, and we're still seeing it. So if you're comparing options, I would say that's certainly something to be a check on the other side. Breaking, which is basically if you have a hack and it causes your hardware to not really be usable at the end of the day, they will provide coverage for that, usually a sublimit, sometimes $1 million. But it's nice to have. It doesn't get used that much, but it's certainly a plus. Cyber terrorism coverage. Most policies now have a term in that basically says if you get a state-sponsored attack, that's not considered to be excluded under the war exclusion. And so that's definitely a plus. You must have that in the policy because a lot of attacks these days have an origination in Russia and China and North Korea. And then cryptojack, basically when somebody gets in and they take over a ton of different computer systems to utilize their energy resources to try and mine for crypto. And that, if not caught, you could have a pretty sizable bill at the end of the day. Sublimit, not a massive exposure, but again, a nice to have. All right, so the other thing about insurance policies is they come with a ton of value added that don't have a cost. And so I mentioned before how you can get access to training courses, phishing and ransomware. I think that's a great use. If you don't already do it and you can get it for free, I think that's worth doing. If you have some issues, you want to get a pre-breach expert consultation, a number of carriers will do that. You can certainly get sample policies for your employees, mobile device, email, removable media. And then, of course, putting together an incident response plan. If you have something on your computer that says John calls Paul, who calls Sheila, and then you get frozen out and it's all online, it's not going to help you. You need to have a written plan, what you're going to do, because you will get a situation at some point, we all do. And that's having an incident response plan is a good plus. And then if you need vendor agreements, templates where you're trying to push some of the exposure onto your vendors, it doesn't guarantee they're going to have the insurance or the ability to pay. But if you can push it that way, and hopefully they can, it will certainly help. And then, of course, breach coach coordinator. So when something happens, somebody's going to go, okay, you need to do this. You've got people in this state, this state, this state. So you've got to inform the DOJ here. You've got to inform the newspaper here. It's a kind of basically a quarterback they're providing. And then as far as for this year and last year, quite frankly, you're going to see more of the state-sponsored terrorism. We're going to see ransom demands going up. I mentioned before, CNA had a $40 million payout last year. Clearly, in this current day and age, remote working is becoming the norm and not the exception. And so whenever you have people that are remote, it increases the potential exposure through Wi-Fi and other things. And then employees are definitely going to be the largest potential exposure to breaches coming forward because it's just making silly mistakes. So training is absolutely key. All right, so that wraps up the presentation on my side. I obviously cannot take any questions right now, but I will say if you have any questions you want to kind of put through, I can be available. You can certainly call me. I don't mind if my number's given out by anybody individually, but you can put through questions through to the folks and we'll respond and get back to you and hopefully help you where we can. And thank you so much for your time, and you all have a good morning.
Okay, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And a big thank you to our presenters. We'll be sending out a recording of this webinar to everyone that attended. And thanks once again.